Leo Strauss was a German-born scholar of political thought. He educated in Germany and later connected with French intellectuals in Paris. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, Strauss briefly resided in England before teaching at Columbia University in the New School for Social Research. He gained reputation during his 20-year tenure at the University of Chicago. Strauss was known for his unique perspective on political thought, which led to a controversial political reputation. Despite unconventional ideas, he maintained friendships with radical intellectuals outside the mainstream of political philosophy. He played a role in shaping political theory and governance in the United States during the late 20th and 21st centuries. Strauss's thought revolves around the question, what is the basis of legitimacy and justice in a political order, particularly the liberal republican constitutional regime? The field that should address this question is philosophy, but the answer must come from outside the territory of politics, meaning it must have a non-political foundation or justification for any political regime. For Strauss, the dominant philosophical answers to this question are insufficient and fail to recognize this very question. According to him, this lack has led to problematic implications, such as relativism, which denies the true value of political standards. In contrast, in his view, the ancient and medieval thinkers addressed these issues more effectively, leading to profound answers that Strauss seeks to revive. In relation to this, the question about the problem of relativism, the lack of justification and foundation of politics, leads to the fact that modernity and enlightenment are a mistake. Therefore, Strauss provided criticism of modern rationalist political philosophy, favoring instead the older form of rationalism that for Strauss was active since the times of Plato and Machiavelli. In fact, his overall thought is rooted in his readings of Plato's dialogues. Here, his analysis of the modern era can be found in his book, Natural Right and History in 1950, where Strauss believed that modern political thinkers like John Locke based their ideas on a distinct foundation compared to ancient thinkers, emphasizing reality over moral ideals. In essence, modern science acknowledges and supports a non-teleological model of the universe, one without purposes and causes. Unlike Aristotle or the religious medieval thinkers, who though religious, also upheld Aristotle's philosophy. For them, the universe and everything within it have purposes, where humans have telos, and to fulfill these purposes, they need virtues. In connection with this, traditional political philosophy believes that a political society rarely manifests goodness and is vulnerable to decline, because a regime with justice and goodness requires clean and honorable rulers and citizens. Therefore, it is challenging to actualize these ideals since there is no automatic procedure to achieve them. Moreover, according to Strauss, political philosophers can describe the necessary conditions but lack the ability to produce them. Hence, classical thinkers acknowledge and accept the distinction between the real and the ideal, to use the ideal as justification and guidance even though the real cannot fully actualize the ideal. In relation to this, modern political philosophy after Niccolo Machiavelli instead attempted to create procedures that would lead to arranging outcomes without presuming virtue in the role of officials and citizens. However, to achieve these goals, it means that their ideals must also be lowered. Thus, the political society now relies on rational self-interest and natural law, meaning that human nature is sufficient for a just and good society. Virtue is not necessary, but a mechanism that translates self-interest in the right direction. Therefore, Modern liberal Republicans believe that an ideal society can be realized in the world. However, this is because for them, the ideal is not as ideal. But the idea of natural law lost its meaning after the works of Isaac Newton, because it emphasizes that modern science and modern physics view nature as neutral in values. Thus, modernity places value in human experience in history and not in nature. Therefore, for Strauss, the modern political tradition gradually forces internal criticism, weakening any notion of natural law that it began with, ultimately leading to nothing but historicism. And historicism is a form of relativism, asserting that the answer to the question, what is good and right, is whatever society dictates at a particular historical period as correct and right. Thus, it also states, for Strauss, that power itself determines what is right and proper, because in a society, those in power determine what the society dictates. And according to Strauss, the modern tradition descended in a direction that led to a three-headed monster, also known as the end of the modern tradition. The first is positivism, which denies possible truth or makes value statements ambiguous. The second is historicism, which creates values relative to its historical stage or period. The third is nihilism, which claims that everything is a form of power. In connection with this, Strauss believes that this transformation occurred in several stages, from Hobbes to Locke, to Rousseau to Burke, to Hegel and to Nietzsche. These philosophers have the notion that rights are in nature or the nature of man, and the idea that humans are rational and capable of recognizing it, respond to the natural and individual interests of the citizens, and serve as a sufficient basis for the morality of politics. Therefore, it states that the nature of man, or the pre-social and pre-rational nature of man, is the source of virtue and political rights. Furthermore, it also states that practice is more fundamental than theoretical reasoning, because a good society is formed through social controls on action without a vision of totality. This means that rights are nothing but a development of individual and free action that emerge in particular societies over the course of history. Thus, modern political theory has led in a direction where, despite itself, it ends up weakening its crucial fundamental notions of standards of political life. Here, Strauss's political lesson is that modern natural law is not effective, so we need pre-modern versions of virtues like Aristotle's ideas. Therefore, Strauss's meticulous reading of the ancient political tradition, from Plato to Machiavelli, reveals deeper aspects of this narrative. In his controversial book, Persecution and the Art of Writing in 1952, Strauss argued that the great tradition of the ancient and medieval philosophers cannot be straightforward because philosophers need to protect themselves from political authorities, so they must resort to lying. Here, Strauss states that throughout the classical tradition, traceable from Hobbes, political philosophers are always required to engage in dissembling in their writings. This is because all societies up to the present suppress and silence philosophy by politicians. So political philosophers are compelled to write in two styles, through the exoteric meaning for their ordinary readers and the esoteric meaning for readers who can read the hidden meanings or between the lines. It has nothing to do with mysticism. Rather, it is a truthful statement about the reality of intellectual life and history. Therefore, the reason why classical philosophers undergo dissembling in their writings, writing in exoteric and esoteric ways, is not solely done because of the danger it poses in the social aspect, since these are external reasons. So why is it inevitable that political philosophers may express things others may not like? For Strauss, this is the deepest issue, and there's a philosophical question about it. Whether the writers encompassed by this question are true philosophers, meaning, according to Strauss, if they genuinely see the profound problems of philosophy. However, Strauss believes that there is a deep inherent conflict between philosophy and politics. This is because for Strauss, and what he believes Plato and other classical philosophers also recognize, philosophy is inherently inconclusive. Philosophy is used to attempt to understand the totality of things, the context of everything, and the foundation of all existence. On the other hand, political philosophy seeks to understand political life and the regime or government as a whole or its foundations. But for Strauss, this cannot be achieved because the investigation of philosophy is endless and incomplete. It is an endless quest that can never fully grasp the totality. Therefore, Strauss is a Platonist, a proponent of Platonism, but he reads Plato in a peculiar way. And Plato, in his philosophy, wrote dialogues, most of which can be described as aphoria, or a situation without a final decision. In many of Plato's dialogues, Socrates poses philosophical questions to people in scenarios, and they give their own responses or answers. But then Socrates would subject these answers to demolition, and the dialogue ends without a definite conclusion. But in other dialogues where they come close to a conclusion or a definite decision, for Strauss, if there are indications that appear, Plato also does not believe that the conclusions are conclusive. Plato also believed that the condition of the intelligibility of things found in the world is the existence of internal, non-historical forms or ideal essences like goodness or justice. However, Plato also asserted that we do not know anyone who has knowledge about this. So the knowledge in the world is based on a superior knowledge that we cannot attain or access, such as the knowledge about God. Here, for Strauss, if we attempt to be political, where all citizens, including philosophers, should participate, and combine it with philosophy, which is often practiced by philosophers, of course, for Strauss, the combination of the two will only lead to perplexity. Because if we desire to achieve a good life as individuals, and also live in a good society, and to accomplish this, of course, we need to know what is good and what constitutes a good society. The knowledge based on the rational pursuit of philosophy needs to know the foundations of all knowledge or the totality. But the study of philosophy shows that this cannot be achieved or accessed. Nevertheless, we need to live and live in an orderly manner. Thus, philosophy inherently reveals the lack of recognition of foundations to address the needs of our political activity. In connection with this, Strauss engaged in a discussion of the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem as a prevalent method in the 19th century to describe the two conflicting sources of Western civilization, the Greco-Roman tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition. Here, Athens represents philosophy, while Jerusalem represents faith and revelation or religion. It is worth noting that Strauss is also recognized as a philosopher, so he aligns with Athens. However, he also acknowledges that Athens is always incomplete or inconclusive, as it pertains to philosophy, while Jerusalem claims to have all the answers because religious faith has the ability to answer everything but lacks the ability to provide the foundations for understanding, since reason cannot know if its answers are true, thus presenting another form of perplexity. Here, Strauss's historical and political point is this. He believes that ancient and medieval philosophers found a way to live without getting trapped in the conflict between the real and the ideal, referring to the transcendent order of standards that cannot be understood or achieved through reason. Though they may not have fully solved the problem, they learn to adapt and live in the best possible manner. That's why they wrote their works in two ways, in an exoteric manner for the public and an esoteric manner for those who understand complex texts. They sought philosophical knowledge of the good, demonstrating that it cannot be attained or accessed through the exoteric way, but simultaneously expressing commitment to a set of moral and political standards and values. Not because they fear attacks from the non-philosophical public, but because they themselves also need to live as individuals in a moral and political community, in accordance with virtues and principles, for without it, life would be meaningless and, above all, valueless. For Strauss, their way of living, despite falling victim to the aforementioned perplexity arising from the unbridgeable conflict between the real and the ideal, is more beneficial than the modern method that attempts to merge and resolve contradictions by bringing the ideal into the real. This will only lead to a lower ideal, a whimsical world where there is a reality devoid of the discipline of the unrealizable ideals, a reality that lacks justification, found only in positivism, historicism, or nihilism. In connection with this, for Strauss, the classical rationalists stand firm on the real and the ideal despite the lack of their reconciliation. Thus, for Strauss, it is more political and philosophical to attempt to bring together the real and the ideal in natural law, because the natural law leads to the submergence of the real and the ideal into each other, which again would only lead to positivism, historicism, and nihilism. Hence, Strauss has his own version of a comprehensive perspective that many historical and philosophical critics also possess, where modern political thought places itself on a flawed foundation. That early modernity was not as problematic because it did not exaggerate itself. However, in the 20th century, it fully revealed and nullified itself. In Strauss's case, there is a need to return and incorporate some of the ancient approaches to these questions to avoid the self-nullifying dialectics found in the 20th century modernity.